The energy systems that have powered the world's economies for over a century were built with a reliance on Earth's natural resources. That has taken a massive toll on our environment. Our entire industrial revolution was built on the concept of unlimited quantities, coal, oil and gas. As the world shifts towards a more sustainable future, the question on everyone's mind is the fossil fuel era coming to an end? And what will replace it? I'm Dave. This is Dave Takes It On. Well, fossil fuels were laid down millions, sometimes billions of years ago, and they took millions of years to form into the fossil fuels. It comes as absolutely no surprise that one day it must run out, and then we must wait for millions of years for it to be refreshed. So what do we do while we wait? Well, Heatmap Labs has been looking into this very subject and discovered a number of tipping points. Their report, The Tipping Point, shows we are nearer to that time than many people realise. In America, renewable energy is rapidly approaching the point where it will exceed the fossil fuel energy. And indeed, in California, it already has. While it's great news for the planet and the environment, it does throw up challenges that need addressing. Well, it is very easy but expensive to just dig more fossil fuel out of the ground. Renewable energy is different. It is much more intermittent. The wind does not always blow, the sun does not always shine. And so as we head towards a renewable energy future, energy storage becomes much more prominent. The old grid is no longer capable of supplying the energy needs of the future. After several decades of reducing consumption of electricity with better products, better efficiency, demand is now very much on the rise. Many of you will blame EVs for this rise, and it actually isn't. AI has made a massive inroad into our daily lives, and for that to work, they need huge data centers. Google has just very recently announced they can't wait any longer. They can't wait for the grid to catch up. They're going to need to build nuclear reactors for themselves to be able to get the power that they need to operate their data centers. And of course, Google is just one company in the AI industry. Tesla, Meta, Amazon, multitude of other companies all entering heavily into the AI industry. And whereas the EV industry is in a prime position to solve its own energy demand, more on that later, AI most definitely is not. They are a massive user of power, well in excess of EVs. Well, let's see what we have to play with. According to NASA, in their Balance of Power in the Earth-Sun System report, we have an absolute mass of just solar power. Typical large electricity generating station generates about 1 billion watts of power each year. And arriving on the planet every year is 44 quadrillion watts of power. So that's the equivalent of 44 million large electricity generating plants. And if I asked you to guess how many we actually have, don't think any of you will come up with a figure of 44 million. Now, in fact, the answer is about 60,000. That's it. 60,000 electricity generating plants around the world. That includes hydroelectric and wind. Which seems totally obvious to everyone that the sun gives us far more energy than we could ever possibly need or even use. Well, it's interesting to look at the split of energy that we in the UK use. On a typical day, wind-generated electricity will outproduce solar PV electricity by a factor of at least 10 to 1. So in simple terms, the sun gives us several million times more energy than we need throughout the whole year, and wind gives us an extra 10x that figure. Well, if anybody out there thinks we're going to run out of electricity any time in the future, they just need to have a look at the hard facts of where we can get it from. The biggest problem with renewable energy is it is intermittent. So while we can generate electricity live to meet our demands, it's not the most economical way of doing it, because that would mean on occasions we'll be using a very small amount of the energy available, and on other occasions we'll be needing a lot more electricity than we're able to generate. And this is the reason why wind power turbines are all such big business these days. First, they do produce more energy overall. Solar power, because in a typical day there'll be as many hours of darkness as of light, they can only produce for half that time. And so a photovoltaic will also only ever be able to operate in decent weather. If the weather is really bad, thick cloud, fog, it's going to be producing virtually nothing. So even if it is daytime, if there are thick clouds or fog about, it won't be working at peak efficiency. So while photovoltaic is not the ideal power source for renewable energy for everything, we have millions of times more than we actually need. So ignoring wind power, hydroelectric, nuclear power, geothermal power, biomass and all other sources, solar PV could produce all the electricity that we require to run our entire country and every other country in the world. Not from here. Our existing grid was developed almost 100 years ago, 100 years next year, from the creation of the Central Electricity Generating Board in 1925. In other words, our grid's 100 years old. Okay, well, while it has evolved over time, for example, the arrival of nuclear reactors, it is largely today based on the concept of being able to get energy whenever we want it from existing sources of fossil fuel, coal, oil, gas, all readily available. However, they have two problems. The first is they will not always be here. There is a finite source of energy stored in the form of fossil fuel. When that is gone, it's gone, and it will take millions of years to replace it. Well, with us, heat map point out, it is not running out of fossil fuel. That's our biggest challenge today. It is the damage that burning fossil fuels does to our environment that is of critical urgency. Now, I do love my analogies, and I've used this one before, so pardon me if you've heard it before. I was actually a Boy Scout in my youth, and we went on scout camps where we'd camp out in literally the middle of nowhere, and we'd survive on whatever we brought with us, campfires and everything else. And I remember, well, as a young scout, asking what were the toilets and being told, oh, just go down the stream, down the bottom, go and pee in the stream, it's all right. And even back then, in my youth as a child, a single thought occurred to me. If I go down to the stream and pee in it, that's absolutely fine. It'll have virtually zero impact whatsoever on the stream. Nature will easily be able to absorb it, dissolve it, dilute it, break it down over a period of time, and it will have zero impact on the environment. But I thought, if 1 million people all walk down from the city, all at the same time, all to the same stream, and all peed in it simultaneously, that would instantly overwhelm it. It would kill the stream, literally stagnant. Even in my childhood, I understood that nature is brilliant at adapting to whatever we do, but it has limits. Likewise, one animal peeing in a field will have no impact, but if you put 10,000 cattle in a single field and they all pee in the field, that does have a big impact on the soil and the quality. So I understood as a child, nature's limited in what it can actually do to counteract what we do. Well, that's the message that most people have not yet understood. Yeah, we've been on the planet for some people say over 1 million years. In modern man form, it's several thousand years, tens of thousands of years maybe. During that time, nature's usually been able to cope with pretty much everything we humans can throw at it. But not anymore. The speed and the quantity of what we're throwing at nature today has got totally out of balance. Nature is at a point where scientists believe it can no longer cope with what we are asking it to do. We are overwhelming it. But don't forget, the environment is absolutely huge. And so the thought of nature just one day saying, oops, can't cope, shut everything down, that's not a realistic scenario. So what are we likely to see? What we will see is nature starting to struggle or have to work much harder to cope with what we are doing to it. And that is something that we are actually seeing everywhere today. Things like the temperature of the environment. Well, this naturally changes over time, over years, centuries, millennia, and millions of years. It's a constant rate of change. But it's the rate of change that worrying climate scientists. We're constantly being told by idiots that the Romans grew grapes in England 2,000 years ago, so there's nothing to worry about. Yeah, unless people are absolute idiots, like those in America's Senate, who one of them took a snowball into the Senate chamber in the winter and said, see, climate change is not a real thing. total morons. But the hard fact is that the temperature of the climate today is already at the highest it has ever been since we humans have been on the planet. And the more worrying thing is that the temperature is increasing, and it is increasing at a rate that is faster and faster each and every single day. So a simple conclusion, we could generate all our electricity for the whole planet just using solar PV. It wouldn't be a good system because in the winter there are very much shorter days, much less solar power available because of the weather. It would be possible, but couldn't use it PV on its own. We'd have to use massive storage. But we would have to take all the energy that's available, excess, in the summertime and try and store that so we could use it in the winter. It's just not practical. So that way of running the national grid from solar PV is just not practical. So the battery storage system is needed to be able to use what we can store. So battery storage is a very big business these days. It's growing all the time. But of course, we're not going to rely that entirely on solar PV. We have wind power. And wind power, we've already said, produces about 10 times as much electricity as photovoltaic power on a typical day. Because it's based on wind, not on light, it is available 24 hours a day. And ironically, the worse the weather, the more power that we can get from it. So we need a combination, wind power, solar power, and that could theoretically run the whole of the UK continuously, really quite easily. But once again, we do need to look at worst case scenario. This is when it is, for example, nighttime, got no solar power, and we also have absolutely no wind whatsoever. So once again, we come back to energy storage. Now in California, they're already there. They've reached the point where California, they produce more electricity from renewable resources than from fossil, and they are now having to install massive energy storage grid connected systems, batteries, at massive pace, simply because more than half the electricity today is being generated by renewable resources, and they don't want to go back to using the fossil fuel. So while our existing grid in the UK is the best part of 100 years old, the future grid needs a total and complete rethink. With the absolutely huge, gigantic increase in use of electricity specifically for AI, and the increase in electricity uses for electric vehicles, and to stop burning fossil fuels, gas and everything in our boilers at home, replace that with electric, we simply need a new style of grid. And it really is that simple. We don't want a 100-year-old grid, we want a new one. We don't need to replace everything. You see all the electricity pylons, cables, switch substations, switchgear, they're absolutely fine. What we just need to change is where the electricity entering the grid comes from. Because many people don't know, National Grid does not generate any electricity at all. National Grid in the UK has a single responsibility, that is to balance what comes in electricity from a variety of sources, that it matches in a quantity that which we're always going to use, or exceeds it on occasions. It then has the responsibility to get that electricity to where it is actually needed. This is the transmission. So our National Grid in the UK does not actually need to change. All the infrastructure is already in place. What the National Grid needs to do is make sure that it sources that electricity from renewable resources. And because renewable resources are intermittent, those sources will include battery storage. So many sources of people saying this, it's difficult to choose which. I'm going to quote here from Octopus Energy. I'm going to use them. They've just produced a report which states National Grid is broken. Renewable developers facing queues of up to 15 years to get projects connected, and we're wasting an incredible amount of energy of low cost, zero carbon electricity each year as transmission build cannot keep pace with renewable generation investments. Now, this does not actually contradict what I said earlier, that the grid does need to change. What the grid needs to do is just change the connections away from fossil fuel generating plants like coal, oil and gas, and connect those into the new power plants coming online, the wind farms and the solar farms. That's it. The amount of energy that we're wasting each year and every year could easily power the whole of the UK. So more and more grid connected battery systems are now being built, and it's up to our government to make sure they get connected. While the grid, the national grid, is no such thing. It's a private company. It's run by investment banks and financiers, and it's there for their own profit. The government does control how they operate. To do this, they have Ofgem. And Ofgem is meant to be the balance between what the grid wants to do as a private company seeking a profit and what us consumers actually need. If the government tomorrow did exactly what they've done with the motor industry and told our national grid that by, let's say, 2030, we must have, for example, 80% of all the electricity coming into the grid coming from renewable resources, and we must have 17 days of storage for any periods where there's no renewable energy coming in at all, then the grid has no choice. If it wants to operate in the UK, it does it. Just like the motor company, they were forced into going renewable, into EVs. Ofgem could easily do exactly the same with our national grid. They just need a staggered approach to do this. It's 2024 now. So they say they need to make the national grid by 2025. You need X percent of renewable energy available inside the grid. And each year after that, just increase that percentage until by a future date, maybe 2030, 2035, 2040, the grid must be fully renewable. Now, I know we've got 2050, but it's an aim. We currently have wishy-washy, airy-fairy targets. The grid is aiming to hope to be somewhere near net zero by 2050. Net zero, by the way, is not the same as 100% renewable. That's 25 years away. What the government and Ofgem could do in half that time is put more and more targets onto the grid to go renewable 100% well before then. 2030 is not an impossible target to get a fully renewable grid. All the EV charger networks, the CPOs, these are charge point operators, they complain about the DNOs, distribution network operators, taking too long to connect the new charger installations to the national grid and also to connect these new producers, the wind farms and the solar farms, also into the national grid. So in the EV charging world, there's now a body sprung up which is now taking over some of that job from the grid. See, the grid is overwhelmed. It just can't cope. It cut its workforce back to an absolute minimum to make a bigger profit. Now it can't cope. What a surprise. But it's structured so that if anyone else wants to do these connections, which they're allowed to do, that they must take responsibility for any part of the grid they connect into. So in other words, a company could be liable for replacing parts of the grid they have nothing to do with if they connect in a charging installation into that. So there's a big incentive not to become these connectors in their own right. So what they do is they connect right up to the grid, they take responsibility for that, and then they ask the DNO from the grid to do the final connection. This, although it requires far less work, it's still taking 5, 10, 15 years to do it. So they should, in theory, be able to get through these very much quicker. But what the government needs to do is just relax this restriction on these connection point operators. These are the ones who connect a charging installation straight into the national grid. If you've got a private company doing it and they've been paid, they'll just connect it there and then, start to finish. The government can take away that restriction which says they must take responsibility for the bit of the grid they haven't even worked on that they didn't connect into. The national grid is broken. It's based on 100-year-old technology and ideas, needs to change. Already some of the major users, the AI companies, are talking about just building their own generating power stations, in particular nuclear ones, and running it purely as a private power supply for their own AI company and their data centres. That really just shows how bad the national grid is. Is everyone one day going to have to generate their own energy? That's an interesting thought. We need them to start flexing the muscles. The government, get in there, start seeing what can be done. We're starting to see this with the water companies. Ofwat, the water regulator, well, it's been absolutely pathetically useless in holding water companies to account until recently. They just take water companies' word for it. Yeah, you're doing all right. Yeah, you can increase your price, etc. But now there's a bit of a, I was going to say something storm, but literally, it's starting to do it because of overwhelming public demand. The public are horrified that they're getting away with this and making record profits and paying dividends. And the energy companies are exactly the same. The national grid is exactly the same. Ofgem is as pathetically useless as Ofwat. We need to get the government to look at it and find out what's the hold-up and why aren't we already 100% renewable today. Then they need to start making changes through Ofgem, putting the responsibilities onto the grid to do it, put up or shut up. If they can't do it, absolutely fine, hand the grid back to us, we'll renationalise it and then we'll do it. Well, thanks very much for watching. I'm Dave. If you have enjoyed this, please click the like button. If you'd like to see more, please click subscribe. It makes such a huge difference to us as a small YouTube channel. For those who'd like to support the channel even more, so that we can carry on making more videos like this, then have a look at our Patreon page for details of membership, and that's down below. And also the links to the reports I've quoted throughout this video, they're down below as well, so you can have a look for yourself. Strongly recommend it. Have a read through it and see whether you think I'm right in what is happening, and see if you can read the full report and see if you can come up with any other alternatives.